Winter has a way of making men honest. At 62, Frank Dawson no longer chased danger. He lived quietly, walking through the snow with his old German Shepherd, Duke. But some people mistake silence for weakness. On the coldest night of the year, they hurt his dog to make him look away. What they didn't know was that a man who has faced darkness his whole life never truly forgets how to stand against it. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We're so curious about it. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Winter arrived early and stayed longer than anyone remembered, wrapping the northern town in silence, ice, and a cold that seeped into bone and memory alike. Frank Dawson had chosen this place precisely because of that silence. The town sat far from highways and headlines, a scattering of low buildings pressed between frozen woods and a gray river that barely moved beneath its skin of ice. At 62, Frank no longer needed noise. He needed distance from the city, from faces that recognized him, from the weight of decisions that never truly faded. He lived alone in a small, weather-beaten house at the edge of town, its porch sagging slightly under decades of snow loads, its windows glowing dimly at night like tired eyes that had seen too much. Frank was a tall man, though age and injury had subtly reshaped him. He stood a little uneven now, favoring his left leg, the result of a shattered knee from a hostage rescue gone wrong 15 years earlier. His shoulders were still broad, built from decades of physical discipline, but they carried a permanent heaviness as if braced for impact that never quite came. His hair, once dark brown, had faded to steel gray, cut short out of habit rather than vanity. A neatly trimmed beard framed a face marked by sharp angles and fine scars, one along the jawline, another faint line near his temple. Souvenirs from a career that had demanded everything and given little back. His eyes were pale blue, alert even at rest, and people who met him briefly often felt as though he was watching something beyond them, measuring distances that did not exist. Frank had been a SWAT officer for nearly 30 years. He had retired quietly, without ceremony, after a final operation left him limping and a younger officer dead. The department called it an honorable end. Frank called it unfinished business he would carry until he no longer carried anything at all. Since then, his temperament had softened on the surface, polite, reserved, distant, but beneath it lay a constant internal tension, a readiness that never powered down. He did not trust easily. He did not relax fully. He had learned, the hard way, that calm was often just the pause before something broke. The only being who understood him without effort walked beside him through the snow. Duke was a German Shepherd, nearly 9 years old, with a thick sable coat darkened along the back and lighter tan fur at the legs and chest. His muzzle had begun to gray, giving him an expression of permanent seriousness, but his body remained powerful, compact, and efficient. Duke moved with a quiet confidence, head low, ears alert, his amber eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Years earlier, he had been Frank's K-9 partner, trained for tracking, search, and protection. Even in retirement, Duke retained the habits of duty, walking slightly ahead, checking corners, pausing when something felt wrong. There was a thin scar along his rib cage from a knife slash sustained during a warehouse raid, and one ear bore a small notch from shrapnel. To Frank, these marks were not flaws. They were proof of shared survival. On most evenings, Frank and Duke followed the same route through town, past the closed hardware store, across the narrow bridge dusted with salt and snow, along the service road that curved near the old industrial zone. The townspeople nodded politely but rarely stopped. Frank was the quiet man with the limp and the serious dog. He suited them just fine that way. The night the shadows returned, the storm arrived without warning. Snow fell fast and heavy, driven sideways by wind that howled between abandoned buildings like something alive. Frank had considered turning back, but Duke had stopped suddenly, muscles tense, nose lifted. That alone was enough to make Frank pause. He followed Duke's gaze toward the edge of the industrial district, where an old cold storage warehouse stood half-collapsed, its metal siding rusted, its windows boarded or broken. The place had been abandoned for years, according to town gossip, too expensive to demolish, too dangerous to reuse. Then Frank heard it, a dull, hollow sound, followed by a sharp cry that cut through the wind. He moved without thinking, instinct overriding age. He stayed in the shadows, pulling Duke close with a subtle hand signal. Through the swirling snow, he saw movement near the loading docks, two figures, one upright and aggressive, the other stumbling, struggling to stay on his feet. A blow landed, hard enough that Frank felt it in his own chest. The second man went down, disappearing briefly behind a snowbank. When he tried to rise, someone grabbed him under the arms and dragged him toward the open maw of the warehouse. Frank's heart began to pound, not with fear, but with recognition. This was not a drunken fight. This was controlled, efficient, the kind of violence meant to end something quietly. He took a step forward, then stopped. The distance was wrong, the footing treacherous. His leg throbbed sharply, warning him of its limits. Duke growled low, restrained but ready. Frank watched as the figures vanished into darkness, the warehouse swallowing sound and motion alike. Within seconds, the snow erased most of the evidence, smoothing the ground as if nothing had happened at all. Frank waited several minutes before approaching. He moved carefully, scanning for threats, his breath visible in the freezing air. Near the dock, he found scuffed snow, a broken glove, and faint streaks of darker color already fading beneath fresh snowfall. Duke lowered his head, sniffed once, then again, his body stiffening. He looked up at Frank, ears angled back, not fear, but certainty. Blood. Frank exhaled slowly. He had hoped, foolishly, that he was wrong. He called the local police from his cell phone, his voice steady, precise. He described what he had seen, the location, the timing. The dispatcher sounded bored, then mildly irritated. When an officer finally arrived nearly 40 minutes later, he was young, broad-faced, with a flushed nose and a parka that looked newer than his boots. He listened, nodded, glanced at the warehouse from a safe distance. "Probably a fight," the officer said. "Hard to say in this weather. No witnesses, no body. We'll note it." Frank studied the man's posture, the way his eyes avoided the warehouse door. "You're not going to check inside?" The officer shrugged. "We don't have probable cause, and that building's unsafe. We'd need more to go on." Frank felt the old frustration rise, sharp and familiar. He recognized the tone, the desire to close a report rather than open trouble. He said nothing more. He had learned when words no longer mattered. The patrol car drove away, its taillights dissolving into the storm. Frank stood there for a long time after, snow collecting on his shoulders. Duke remained alert, nose pressed to the ground, tracing a path that led away from the warehouse toward the river road. Frank placed a gloved hand on Duke's neck, feeling the steady strength there. A quiet promise passed between them, unspoken but absolute. Whatever had happened here was not finished, and neither, Frank realized, was he. Morning came without light. The storm had passed, but it left behind a world muted by white, the sky low and heavy as if it might collapse under its own weight. Frank Dawson woke before dawn, the ache in his leg already sharp, already familiar. He sat on the edge of his bed for several minutes, breathing slowly, letting the pain settle into something manageable. Duke lay nearby, alert even in rest, his head lifting the moment Frank moved. There was a stiffness to the dog's posture that hadn't been there the day before, a tension that mirrored Frank's own. The town spoke in whispers after the storm. Not literal ones. People still chatted at the diner, still exchanged pleasantries at the gas station. But there was a subtle tightening, a carefulness in what wasn't said. Frank noticed it immediately. He had learned long ago that silence was rarely empty. It was usually full of fear or obedience or both. He started asking questions anyway. Frank moved carefully, favoring side streets, letting Duke set the pace. The old hardware store owner knew nothing. The waitress at the diner looked away too quickly. It was a man at the feed supply warehouse, older, heavy-set, with rough hands and a permanently stooped back, who finally spoke a name after making Frank promise not to repeat it. Grant Holloway. The name landed with weight. Holloway ran winter logistics, frozen goods, cold transport, seasonal storage. His trucks moved when others couldn't. His contracts kept the town supplied when roads iced over and power faltered. People didn't like him, but they depended on him, and dependence had a way of dulling outrage. Frank learned what he could without pressing too hard. Holloway was in his late 50s, tall and broad, with a reputation for charm that never quite reached his eyes. He had a habit of smiling without warmth, of shaking hands too firmly, as if every greeting was a test of dominance. He dressed well for a man in logistics, tailored coats, leather gloves, boots that never seemed to touch mud. Years ago, a federal investigation into shipping irregularities had surfaced, then vanished. No charges, no explanations, just quiet. That alone was enough to make Frank uneasy. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. That evening, Frank took Duke out along the river road, a stretch of ice-polished asphalt bordered by leafless trees and snowbanks higher than a man's waist. The air was brittle, cold enough to sting lungs. Duke walked close, his gait steady but watchful. Frank noticed the sound of an engine before he saw the vehicle. A dark pickup rolled to a stop ahead of them, tires crunching over packed snow. Two men stepped out. They were built differently than the locals, heavier, cleaner. Both wore insulated jackets without logos and gloves that had never shoveled snow. One was tall and lean, with a narrow face and closely cropped hair, his jaw sharp and clean-shaven. The other was shorter, thick-necked, with a reddish beard trimmed close to the skin and eyes that held no curiosity, only calculation. They moved with the casual confidence of men accustomed to being obeyed. "Evening," the taller one said, voice calm, practiced. "Cold night for a walk." Frank stopped, subtly shifting his weight. "My dog needs exercise." The bearded man glanced at Duke, his mouth curling slightly. "That dog needs to stay out of places he doesn't belong." Frank felt the warning before it was spoken. "I walk public roads." The taller man smiled, thin and empty. "Not everything that's public is safe." It happened quickly. Too quickly for Frank's injured leg to react. The bearded man stepped forward and drove his boot hard into Duke's side. The sound was wrong, dull, sickening. Duke yelped, the noise sharp with pain, and staggered, collapsing into the snow. Frank moved instinctively, reaching for Duke, rage flaring hot and immediate, but the taller man blocked him with an arm like iron. "Forget what you saw," the man said quietly. "Forget the warehouse. Forget the night. This is your reminder." Frank's hands shook, not with fear, but with restraint. He knew exactly how much force it would take to break the man's nose, how to drop him fast. He also knew he wouldn't get a second chance before the other man intervened. Duke whined softly, trying to rise, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Frank lowered himself slowly beside Duke, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "We're done." The men exchanged a glance. The bearded one spat into the snow. "Good." They left as abruptly as they'd arrived, the truck disappearing down the road, leaving only tire tracks and silence behind. Frank stayed there for several minutes, one hand pressed against Duke's ribs, feeling the shallow, rapid breaths. Duke's eyes met his, trusting, unafraid despite the pain. Frank swallowed hard. He had seen that look on faces he couldn't save. He wouldn't see it again. He carried Duke home, step by careful step, his leg screaming with every movement. By the time he reached his truck, sweat soaked his collar despite the cold. He drove straight to the only place open at that hour. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town, a squat building with bright fluorescent lights that cut harshly through the darkness. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Dr. Megan Hart looked up from a cluttered desk the moment Frank came through the door. Megan Hart was in her early 40s, tall and spare, with shoulders that carried quiet strength. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a low, practical bun, strands escaping to frame a face marked by fatigue and focus rather than softness. Her skin was pale, weathered by long hours and little sleep, and her eyes, gray, observant, missed very little. She wore scrubs under a heavy sweater, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing faint scars along her forearms. She moved with efficiency, without wasted motion, the manner of someone used to emergencies. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for gloves. "Assault," Frank said. He did not elaborate. Megan examined Duke quickly, hands firm but gentle, fingers probing ribs with practiced care. Duke flinched but did not resist. "He's lucky," she said after a moment. "Bruised ribs, maybe a crack, no puncture, painful but survivable." Frank released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As Megan worked, she spoke quietly, almost to herself. "You know, you're not the first one to come in lately with injuries tied to that side of town." Frank looked up. "What kind of injuries?" "Working dogs," she said. "Sled teams, pull dogs, healthy animals suddenly failing, lungs burned, organs damaged. She met his eyes then. Industrial chemicals. Stuff they shouldn't be breathing. The pieces began to align, slow and inevitable. The warehouse, the trucks, the silence. Frank nodded once. "Thank you." Megan finished bandaging Duke and stepped back. "Whoever did this wanted to scare you, not kill your dog." Frank's jaw tightened. They succeeded at one of those. As he helped Duke to his feet, Frank felt the old resolve settle into place, heavy and unwelcome, but undeniable. Someone had crossed a line. Not just with him, but with something that could not defend itself. And Frank Dawson had never been very good at walking away from that. The power went out just after dusk, not with drama, but with a quiet finality that felt heavier than noise, the lights dimming once before surrendering the town to darkness as the storm returned with renewed force. Snow fell thicker than before, wind pushing it sideways so it scraped against walls and windows like sand. Frank Dawson stood at his kitchen window and watched the world disappear by degrees, the familiar ache in his leg blooming into a sharp, insistent pain as pressure dropped and cold settled in. Duke lay on his blanket near the stove, ribs bandaged, chest rising carefully, amber eyes tracking Frank's movements with the steady patience of a partner who understood restraint. The dog's gait had changed since the attack, not broken but guarded, each breath measured, yet the intelligence in his gaze was undimmed. Frank moved slowly, deliberately, pulling on insulated boots and a heavy coat, the same one he had worn on long winter callouts years ago, the fabric scuffed and softened by use. He checked his phone, no signal, no bars, then the radio on the counter, which answered with static and nothing else. The town was blind and quiet, and Frank knew from experience that darkness did not create danger, it merely revealed where it had been waiting. He knelt beside Duke and pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's, a simple ritual that needed no words, and when Duke rose with a soft grunt and followed him to the door, Frank felt the decision settle into place, heavy and irrevocable. The warehouse sat a mile away, its outline swallowed by drifting snow, and Frank took the back route, keeping to streets where the wind scoured ice clean and his boots found surer purchase. His leg protested with every step, a deep throb that warned him how thin the margin was now, how much he relied on memory and caution rather than strength. Near the industrial district, he paused and listened, counting seconds between gusts, letting the silence speak. It did. Far off, an engine coughed to life and died, then returned to a steady idle. Frank moved into cover and waited, patience honed by years of holding positions until the moment was right. He did not approach the warehouse directly. Instead, he circled, noting tire tracks freshly cut into snow, heavier than local traffic, their tread distinctive. He set to work with care, mounting a compact wildlife camera to a utility pole that overlooked a public access road, its lens angled to catch license plates without intruding on private property, the device camouflaged with a sleeve of dull tape to break its outline. He placed a second camera farther down the road where the snow drifted thinly, then a third near the river bend where trucks slowed. Each placement took time, his fingers stiff with cold, his breathing controlled. He added a small audio recorder inside a public trash enclosure near the loading approach, its microphone shielded against wind, recording only what passed in the open air. Nothing fancy, nothing illegal, just observation, the kind that had saved lives when paperwork failed. Duke stayed close, positioning himself where he could see and smell without drawing attention, the bandage white against his dark coat, a quiet reminder of what waited if Frank miscalculated. The blackout deepened, and with it came movement. Headlights cut narrow tunnels through the snow, then vanished. An hour passed, then another. Frank shifted his weight and swallowed the pain, eyes never leaving the road. Near midnight, a convoy appeared. 2 trucks, then a third. Their engines low, muffled, moving with the confidence of drivers who expected no interference. They did not stop at the warehouse entrance at first, but rolled past, turned and returned, a practiced loop meant to confirm the absence of witnesses. Frank watched them ease into position, doors opening and closing with metallic finality, the sound carrying farther in the dead air. He did not move closer. He did not need to. The cameras blinked, the recorder hummed, and the night gave up what it had been holding. When the trucks finally pulled away, Frank waited again, then slipped back along his route, the wind erasing his tracks almost as soon as he made them. He reached home hours later, exhausted, leg burning, Duke's breathing rough but steady, and set the devices to transmit when power returned. He slept in his chair by the stove, boots still on, the radio a useless comfort on the table beside him. Morning brought no light, only a paler gray, but the power returned with a shudder and a hum, the house stirring awake. Frank checked the feeds and felt the cold clarity settle in as images resolved, timestamps, plates, the unmistakable silhouettes of refrigerated trailers moving when the town slept. He copied files to a drive, labeled them carefully, and wrapped the device in plastic before tucking it into a coat pocket. At the clinic, Dr. Megan Hart met him at the door, her posture straight despite the long night, her hair pulled back tighter than before, dark circles beneath her gray eyes. She listened without interrupting as Frank explained only what she needed to know, her expression tightening not with fear but with resolve. Megan had learned to keep her voice even in field hospitals where panic was contagious. It was a habit that never left her. She nodded once, then went to a locked cabinet and retrieved her phone, stepping aside to make a call she had hoped never to place. The man who answered was Daniel Cross, a state investigator she had worked alongside years earlier during a joint response to a chemical spill near a base hospital, a tall, lean man with close-cropped black hair and a perpetually furrowed brow that came from too many late nights and too few simple answers. His voice, when Megan spoke his name, softened only briefly before returning to the careful neutrality of someone who understood implications. She told him what she had seen over the months, dogs failing without explanation, lungs burned by air that should have been clean, and what Frank had gathered in a single night when the town went dark. There was a pause on the line, long enough for Frank to imagine the machinery turning. Then Cross asked for the files and a location, his tone clipped and precise. Megan agreed without hesitation, ending the call and meeting Frank's eyes with a look that carried both warning and gratitude. Outside, the wind eased and snow fell straight down, thick and quiet, and Frank felt the weight of the choice he had made settle into something steadier. He walked Duke out into the pale morning and watched the warehouse from a distance, not with anger now, but with a calm, hard patience. He would not rush, he would not step back. The truth, once uncovered, had a way of forcing doors open even in winter. The snow changed its character as night fell, thickening into heavy, deliberate flakes that muted sound and distorted distance, turning familiar streets into corridors of shadow and white. Frank Dawson felt it in his bones before he saw it in the sky, that subtle shift when weather stopped being background and became an accomplice. His leg ached dully, no longer sharp but constant, a reminder that time was not on his side. Yet his mind was clear in a way it had not been for years. He had learned long ago that confrontation did not always arrive with raised voices or flashing lights. Sometimes it came disguised as compromise. That was the approach he chose now. The message went out quietly, through channels that did not leave fingerprints, that Frank was willing to talk, that he understood the power structures of a small town in winter and was prepared to step aside if given reason. The reply came sooner than expected, delivered through a local intermediary who never said Grant Holloway's name aloud, but did not need to. The meeting would take place at the old cold storage warehouse, neutral ground, after midnight, when roads were empty and attention thin. Frank accepted without hesitation, because hesitation would have read as fear. He prepared carefully, packing light, relying on memory rather than gear, and checking on Duke, who rested near the stove with his bandage changed and ribs still tender. Duke lifted his head as Frank moved, ears angling forward, reading intention from posture alone. Frank knelt and ran a hand along the dog's neck, feeling the steady heat there, and spoke softly, not to reassure Duke, but himself. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint industrial smell that had begun to feel like a warning. He left Duke at home, an act of restraint that cost him more than he expected, and stepped into the night alone, his boots crunching softly as snow fell hard enough to erase his tracks behind him. The warehouse loomed out of the darkness, its metal sides groaning faintly as temperature dropped, a relic of older commerce and newer secrets. Frank did not approach directly. He circled once, counting exits, noting where snow lay undisturbed and where it did not. The lights flickered on inside, dim and yellow, throwing long shadows that bent and stretched across the yard. He entered through the main bay door and stopped just inside, letting his eyes adjust, letting the cold settle. Grant Holloway stood near a folding table at the center of the space, his presence controlled, deliberate. Holloway was taller than Frank remembered from descriptions, broad through the shoulders, with silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples and a neatly trimmed beard that softened nothing. His coat was expensive, the kind designed to look practical without ever being tested by real labor. His eyes were pale and appraising, and when he smiled, it was with the practiced ease of a man used to buying solutions rather than earning them. Beside him stood a man Frank recognized as a lawyer type, thin, immaculate, hair slicked back despite the cold, Julian Mercer by reputation, someone whose suits cost more than Frank's truck and whose loyalty shifted with contracts. Two others lingered at the edges, hands in pockets, posture casual but wrong, bodies angled to control space. Frank did not sit when Holloway gestured to a chair. He remained standing, weight balanced, the ache in his leg contained by habit. Holloway spoke first, his voice smooth, unhurried, carrying easily in the empty building. He talked about misunderstandings, about winter pressures, about how towns survived when people cooperated. He talked about generosity, about donations, about the value of forgetting unpleasant nights. Frank listened, saying little, letting Holloway fill the space with words that revealed more than he intended. When the offer came, it was framed as assistance rather than payment, a chance for Frank to move on without trouble. Frank nodded once, not in agreement but acknowledgement, and asked a single question about safety, about what happened when accidents occurred near Holloway's operations. The temperature shifted then, not in the air but in the room. One of the men at the edge took a step closer, boots scraping lightly on concrete. Holloway's smile tightened. "Accidents," he said, "are unpredictable." That was when Frank knew the trap had been set from the beginning. The lights flickered again, and for a moment the only sound was wind pushing against steel. Frank moved first, not forward but sideways, toward a wall where an old emergency control panel sat half forgotten, its casing dented, its label faded. He had noticed it on his circuit, the kind of thing inspectors demanded decades ago and owners ignored until needed. As a hand reached for his arm, Frank slammed the panel open and pulled the lever with everything he had left. The effect was immediate and chaotic. Alarms shrieked to life, a piercing mechanical wail that bounced off walls and ceiling, lights snapping to harsh red, then white, then red again, the emergency system cycling through failsafes never meant to be triggered in sequence. Men shouted, voices overlapping, confusion spreading faster than fear. One of the guards lunged, reaching for Frank, and Frank turned into him, using momentum rather than strength, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending him sprawling. The lawyer stumbled backward, slipping on snow-tracked in, his composure cracking as he fell hard against the table. Holloway cursed, a sharp, ugly sound that stripped away polish. Frank felt a blow glance off his side, pain flaring, and he dropped to one knee, breath hitching as his injured leg buckled under sudden strain. He did not stay down. He forced himself up, using the edge of the table, his vision narrowing, the alarms pounding his skull. Outside, tires crunched fast, then stopped, doors slamming as if more men were arriving or retreating. Frank could not tell which, and he did not wait to find out. He staggered toward the bay door, snow swirling in through the opening, and threw himself into the night, the cold shocking him into clarity. He ran until running became limping, until limping became stumbling, and only stopped when the warehouse was a distant, screaming shape behind him. He leaned against a snowbank, chest burning, and listened as sirens joined the alarms, distant at first, then closer, the sound cutting through the storm. Later, much later, Frank sat in his truck with the engine running, hands shaking not from cold but from the release of restraint, and thought about Duke, about Megan, about the files already sent and the call that would follow. He had not won anything tonight, but he had proven something essential. The men who believed themselves untouchable had panicked, and panic, Frank knew, left traces no snowstorm could hide. Morning arrived quietly. The storm spent at last, leaving behind a pale sky and snow that glistened as if nothing violent had ever passed through it. Frank Dawson woke in his chair before the sun fully rose, the engine of his truck still warm from the night before, his body stiff and aching in a way that spoke of limits reached and barely respected. His leg throbbed with a deep, punishing insistence, but his head was clear. That, he knew, mattered more. He drove home slowly, choosing roads where the snow had begun to melt into slush, the town emerging from darkness like a patient opening its eyes after surgery. Duke was waiting at the door when Frank stepped inside, the German shepherd rising carefully, ribs still tender but spirit unbroken. The dog's coat caught the early light, sable fur streaked with gray, his intelligent eyes locking onto Frank's face with immediate assessment. Duke sniffed him once, then leaned his weight gently into Frank's leg, a wordless check-in that carried relief, trust, and quiet approval. Frank knelt with effort and rested his forehead against Duke's, breathing in the familiar scent of fur and antiseptic from the bandages, grounding himself in the certainty that this at least remained intact. The day moved quickly after that, events catching up to intention. Sirens passed through town in pairs and threes, not frantic but purposeful, the sound of systems waking up. By mid-morning, unmarked vehicles appeared near the industrial district, their plates unfamiliar, their occupants efficient and unreadable. Daniel Cross arrived without spectacle, stepping out of a dark sedan with the calm assurance of someone who preferred results to recognition. He was dressed plainly in a heavy coat and boots scuffed from real use, his tall, lean frame relaxed but alert, black hair cropped close against the cold. His face bore the lines of a man who carried too many open cases in his head, the furrow between his brows deepened by years of asking questions people resented. When Frank met him near the edge of the warehouse perimeter, Cross studied him for a moment, eyes moving from Frank's guarded posture to the faint limp he did not bother to hide, then to the dog sitting at his side, steady and watchful. "You did good work," Cross said, not as praise but as acknowledgement. Frank nodded once. He did not need thanks. Megan Hart joined them a moment later, her coat buttoned high, hair pulled back tight, her movements brisk despite the exhaustion in her eyes. She looked between the two men, then down at Duke, offering a small smile that carried more relief than joy. Megan had seen enough endings that she never celebrated early. The investigation unfolded with methodical precision. Cross's team moved through the warehouse and along the routes Frank had documented, photographing, cataloging, sealing. Refrigerated trailers were opened, manifests checked against reality, air samples taken where the smell lingered faintly despite the cold. The pieces aligned quickly once pressure was applied from outside the town's closed circle. Grant Holloway was brought in for questioning before noon, his composure intact until it wasn't. Under fluorescent lights, without the comfort of silence and leverage, his polished calm fractured into irritation, then anger, then the brittle quiet of a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted. Julian Mercer followed, less controlled, his confidence dissolving into complaints and legal threats that found no purchase in the face of evidence already moving beyond his reach. Frank did not sit in on the interrogations. He waited outside with Duke, watching steam rise from melting snow along the road, listening to the town breathe again. By afternoon, word spread quickly, as it always did in small places, but this time it carried a different tone. Doors opened, people lingered, conversations paused when Frank passed, not out of fear but recognition. He returned to the clinic to check on Duke, who submitted patiently to Megan's careful hands as she confirmed what Frank already sensed. The dog would heal fully, given time and rest. Megan's shoulders eased for the first time in days, and she allowed herself a quiet laugh when Duke tried to lick her face despite the bandage. "Stubborn," she said fondly, just like his handler. The comment surprised them both, and Megan's smile faded into something more thoughtful. "You didn't have to do this alone," she added, not as reproach but as fact. Frank considered that, the habit of isolation hard to shed. "I didn't," he said finally, resting a hand on Duke's neck. Evening brought closure without ceremony. Cross returned to Frank's house as the sun dipped low, the sky streaked with gold and pale blue, snow receding into wet patches along the road. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, posture relaxed for the first time. "Charges are moving forward," he said. "Federal, state. It'll take time, but Holloway's done. The routes are shut down, the chemicals traced. Your footage made the difference." Frank listened, then nodded, the weight he'd carried for days loosening at last. Cross hesitated, then extended a hand. Frank took it, the grip brief but firm, two men acknowledging work done the right way. When Cross left, the quiet that followed felt earned rather than empty. Frank and Duke walked that evening as they always had, but the air was different, lighter, the road less oppressive. Snow crunched softly underfoot, melting enough to reveal dark pavement beneath, and Frank realized the metaphor without trying to. At the river bend, Duke paused, lifting his head, ears catching distant sounds, then relaxed again. Frank smiled faintly, a rare expression that felt strange on his face. He had not returned to the man he once was, and he did not want to. That life was finished. But something new had taken its place. Not redemption, not peace, but purpose, shaped to fit the years he had left. As night settled, lights glowed warm in windows across town, and for the first time since arriving, Frank did not feel like an outsider passing through. Winter would come again, as it always did, but it no longer felt endless. Frank unlocked his door, Duke at his side, and stepped into a future quieter than his past, yet strong enough to hold what remained. This story reminds us that real strength does not always come from youth, power, or loud victories. Sometimes it comes from quiet endurance, from choosing to stand up even when your body is tired and the world tells you to look away. In everyday life, we may not face snowstorms or dangerous men, but we all face moments when doing the right thing feels heavy and lonely. Like Frank, courage often means taking one careful step forward, protecting what matters, and trusting the truth will eventually surface. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need this reminder today. Leave a comment about the moment that moved you most, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience, justice, and the quiet strength that lives in ordinary people. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps, and thank you so much for watching.